So as Paul was mentioning, I have recently published a book on the role and imagery of animals in Indian Buddhist literature. And the book covers a number of different areas. For example, the animal realm of rebirth in Indian Buddhist doctrine and cosmology, the metaphorical use of different categories of animals, such as the wild versus the tamed, the imagery surrounding particular species of animals, such as elephants, lions, deer, monkeys, and jackals, and the role that certain named and individualized animals play within the life story of the Buddha. For example, the horse Jataka and the elephant Nalagiri. But the part of the book I want to focus on today has to do with a very particular group of animals, and those are the highly anthropomorphized and speaking animals that we find in the genre of the Jatakas. And I want to look at the Jatakas as a genre of Buddhist literature that I believe offers a counter view to the dominant view of animals conveyed in Buddhist doctrine. And I want to argue that this counter view is made possible by depicting animals who speak. Animals who speak are given a voice, and by means of that voice, we are able to hear another perspective and enter into another world. A world in which, rather than human beings looking suspiciously at animals, the animals look suspiciously back at us. So let me begin by first summarizing the dominant view of animals conveyed in Buddhist doctrine. In short, I would say that it is a very negative view in which animals hold a low and miserable status. Rebirth as an animal is classified as an unfortunate destiny. This is my translation of the Sanskrit term durgati, which could also just be translated as bad rebirth, karmically brought about by the immoral deeds one has done in the past. Rebirth as an animal is therefore something unfortunate, something terrible, something to be avoided at all costs. It is full of fear and suffering, first and foremost because animals live by the so-called law of the fishes, or what we would call the law of the jungle. They are constantly devouring one another, and they do nothing but worry about eating and being eaten. As the Mahavastu tells us, they devour one another, they drink one another's blood, they kill one another, they destroy one another. Living short and brutish lives, they continually suffer from cold, heat, hunger, and thirst. They're also promiscuous and even incestuous, having sex with their own mothers and sisters. They don't recognize social boundaries because they don't have language and the social boundaries that language makes possible. According to one commentarial passage, for example, because they cannot say to themselves, "This is my mother," they lack the shame and conscience that would keep them from violating their own mothers. They're also lacking in intelligence and the higher mental faculties, and as a result, they have very little ability to cultivate their minds. In fact, one of the things I have noticed is the lack of Sanskrit verbs suggesting cultivation or mental development over time being used in connection with animals. And they have very little moral agency or ability to do good deeds and thereby better their positions within the karmic hierarchy. In fact, once you are reborn as an animal, it's said to be extraordinarily difficult to make it back to the human realm. Instead, as the Mahavastu tells us, they go from darkness to darkness, from state of suffering to state of suffering, from unfortunate destiny to unfortunate destiny, from state of ruin to state of ruin. In short, as the Buddha himself observes in the Balapandita Sutta, monks, I could speak in so many ways about the animal realm, but it wouldn't be easy, monks, to capture through speaking the suffering of the animal realm. In that realm, there is no righteous conduct, no tranquil conduct, no wholesome action, no meritorious action. In that realm, monks, there is only mutual devouring and devouring of the weak. So this is the dominant view of the animal conveyed in Buddhist doctrine. And throughout many of the passages conveying this view, one also senses a kind of constant human anxiety to keep animals apart and categorically separate from human beings. Yes, it's true, as many people have pointed out, that human beings can be reborn as animals and animals as human beings, so there is obviously movement between the categories. Nevertheless, the categories themselves are consciously kept apart and given different moral valences. Buddhism is a profoundly human-centered tradition, and animals, in a sense, must be kept ontologically distinct in order to safeguard the prerogative, the privilege, and the uniqueness of being a human being, who alone, according to Buddhism, can attain the ultimate goals of nirvana or awakening as a Buddha. Where then might we find an alternative view of the animal? Where can we hear the animal itself speak? Well, there is one genre of Buddhist literature that often features speaking animals, and that is, of course, the Jatakas. Since the Buddha himself was an animal in many of his previous lives and throughout his bodhisattva career, many of the Jatakas relating those lives involve animals who speak. I'd here like to focus on the Pāli collection of Jatakas, the Jataka Takata, a massive collection of 547 Jataka stories, including many that feature highly anthropomorphized animal characters, animals who think, speak, plan, and reason much in the manner of human beings, and animals who often depart rather starkly from the standard doctrinal view of the animal realm. The Jatakas are somewhat unique in this sense. Other genres of Buddhist literature generally involve more naturalistic depictions of animals, or sometimes involve animals who think but do not speak. In the Buddha's life story, for example, the horse Kantaka and the elephant Nalagiri are two good examples of animals who do clearly think, and we are often told exactly what they are thinking, but who do not speak. So, how should we interpret the speaking animals of the Pāli Jatakas? Well, several scholars have pointed out that one of the basic conventions of the Jataka genre is that every animal character within the story of the past is usually presented as the previous birth of a human character in the story of the present. Therefore, one could say that these animals are not really animals at all. Instead, they are foreshadowings of later human beings. And this is what distinguishes them from the more naturalistic animals found elsewhere in Buddhist literature. Taking a somewhat different tack, other scholars have pointed out, especially for the Pāli Jataka collection, that many of the stories were clearly borrowed from pre-Buddhist Indian folklore and then given a superficial Buddhist veneer. And if we do see these stories as essentially old folk tales, then it's possible to interpret them much as we might interpret something like Aesop's fables. In other words, these are simple didactic tales teaching lessons of practical wisdom. There's nothing necessarily Buddhist about them, and the animals that appear within them are not really animals at all. Instead, they are allegorical human beings, and this is why they speak. So there are several ways, in other words, of downplaying the animality of these animals and thereby lessening the extent to which they depart from the standard doctrinal view of the animal realm. In contrast to these views, however, I would like to argue that the animals of the Pāli Jatakas are not just allegorical human beings or foreshadowings of human beings. Instead, their animality continues to matter. And we can see this if we listen to what these speaking animals choose to speak about. One of the things they speak about at great length is rampant human abuse and exploitation of the animal world and the enormous suffering animals experience at the hands of human beings. In fact, when animals are given a voice, it is often human beings who are morally repugnant. It is human language that is slippery and deceptive and never to be trusted. And conversely, it is animals who display both agency and intelligence in their constant efforts to evade human beings, escape from human harm, and outwit human plans. There are many Jatakas, for example, about deer using various methods and strategies to outwit the hunters who try to kill them, or about different species of animals all working together to outsmart the humans who wish to harm them. There are stories addressing a range of different themes involving the human abuse of animals, including, for example, meat eating, hunting and trapping, animal sacrifice, cruelty toward animals, pet keeping, and the criminal punishment and execution of animals. Moreover, not only do speaking animals speak about human abuse of the animal world, but in many of the Jatakas, they go significantly further than that. They display greater virtue than human beings. They preach the Dharma to human beings. They convert human beings to the side of morality. especially immoral kings and the corrupt human institutions over which such kings preside. And they often secure the well-being of other animals in the process. They sometimes seem to function, in fact, as animal activists. So they call human beings to a higher moral standard, and they ask humanity to live up to its unique moral capacities. The Jatakas thus provide us with an alternative view, using the perspective of the animal to cast a harsh and unforgiving light on the moral shortcomings of humankind. And they're able to do that, of course, because they feature animals who speak and are thereby given a voice. Now, there are many different examples of this discourse that I could talk about, but what I'd like to focus on today is something a little bit more specific, and something I didn't really look at systematically in the book. Instead, I'm sort of pulling it together from several different bits and pieces, and therefore my ideas, just a warning here, are a little bit scattered. But I'd like to focus on the theme of human language itself, the oddity of animals who make use of human language, the differences between human language and animal cries, the difficulties of communicating across the human-animal divide, and the tragedies brought about by miscommunication. So this is the range of themes I want to focus on. And as I said, I'm sort of pulling together different bits of the book that surround these various themes and trying to make some sense of them. Okay, so the first two stories I want to talk about have to do with animal sacrifice. The Buddha's thorough repudiation of the Vedic tradition of animal sacrifice is well known from some of his early discourses. But while animal sacrifice is condemned in these early discourses, the focus is upon its ineffectiveness, the fact that it doesn't work, or on its negative consequences for the sacrificer in the form of karmic retribution. No attention is paid to the pain, suffering, or experience of the sacrificial animal itself. This is precisely the perspective that is added, however, when we turn to the Pāli Jātakas. With their animal-centric focus, the Jatakas shift our perspective from the sacrificer to the sacrificial animal, to give the animal a voice and reveal the animal's pain and suffering. In the Mattakabhata Jataka, a Brahmin is preparing a goat for a public sacrifice before a great crowd of people when he hears the animal first laugh and then weep. Right away, we are struck by the fact that the sacrificial animal is given a voice and the sacrifice is thereby interrupted. This being a Jataka, moreover, the animal is also endowed with the human power of speech. Thus, when the Brahmin asks the goat why he first laughed and then wept, the goat is able to respond. Brahmin, he says, at one time I was a Brahmin well versed in the Vedic scriptures just like you. Thinking that I would make an offering for my ancestors, I killed a goat and made the offering. And because I killed that single goat, I have had my own head cut off in 499 existences. This is the 500th and final existence in which I will suffer this punishment. Realizing that today I would become free of such suffering, I was full of joy, and this is why I laughed. But then I thought to myself, just as I have endured the suffering of having my head cut off in 500 existences because I killed a single goat, this Brahmin, having killed me, will likewise endure the same suffering. And feeling pity for you, I cried. Upon hearing this explanation from the goat, the Brahmin, as we might expect, immediately puts a stop to the sacrifice. So here, what I think is effective is that rather than being given an abstract statement saying that animal sacrifice is immoral, here we are given the concrete image of a goat having its head cut off in 500 successive lifetimes, and we are told of this from the mouth of the goat himself. The victim himself speaks directly to the perpetrator. We also see here the kinship and reciprocity between sacrificer and sacrificed. He who was once the human sacrificer will soon become the animal sacrificed. The distinction between sacrificer and sacrificed is blurred, and the communion between them is furthered by their shared ability to laugh, weep, and speak. So, human language in this instance succeeds in bringing humans and animals together, allowing the human character to recognize his essential equivalence with the animal he is about to slaughter. We might contrast this now with another Jataka involving animal sacrifice, the Lomasakasapa Jataka. Here, a saintly and virtuous ascetic is offered the king's daughter in marriage if he will only agree to perform a violent animal sacrifice. Overtaken by his lust for the beautiful princess, the ascetic falls away from his state of virtue and agrees to perform the sacrifice. But just as he is raising his sword to bring down upon the neck of an elephant, quote, "The elephant, seeing this, was terrified by the fear of death and let out a great cry. And hearing this cry, the rest of the elephants, horses, bulls, and other animals, terrified by the fear of death, also cried out in fear. And the great crowd of people likewise cried out in fear," end quote. So here, it isn't human language that bridges the gap between human beings and animals, but rather the equal tendency of both humans and animals to cry out when overcome by fear. Hearing this cacophony of non-linguistic cries, the ascetic then, quote, "looked down at himself and realized that he too had matted hair, a beard, and body hair like grass. Full of remorse, he thought to himself, 'Alas, I am doing an evil and unworthy deed,'" end quote. So in this case, it is a realization that both human beings and animals have bodies that are covered with hair and both erupt into guttural noises when faced with the fear of death that bridges the gap between sacrificer and sacrificed and puts an immediate end to the slaughter. This realization is brought about not by human language, but by the spontaneous cries of the animals, which then spread to the human beings as well. The animals in this story may not speak, but, as is usual in the Jatakas, they are still given a voice. If we consider these two stories involving animal sacrifice together, we can see in both of them that there is a concern with the chasm separating human beings from animals and the kind of human exceptionalism that leads to practices like animal sacrifice. Both stories recognize this chasm, but are also eager to depict successful communication across the human-animal divide, linguistic in one case and non-linguistic in the other, so that humans and animals are brought closer together, and the humans in the story can learn to see the world around them as, in Thomas Berry's words, a communion of subjects rather than a collection of objects. And both stories present this recognition as an essential element of the Bodhisattva's progress toward Buddhahood. Now, while both of the Jatakas I just talked about involve successful communication between human beings and animals, there are other Jatakas involving failure or difficulty. I'd like to turn now to a story that directly addresses the difficulty of communicating across the human-animal divide and the possible need to translate animal sounds into words that human beings can appreciate. In the Uttasada Jataka, the king of Benares is sitting on his bed in the middle of the night when he hears 8 ominous sounds that fill him with fear, 6 of which are made by animals: a crane, a crow, an insect, a cuckoo, a deer, and a monkey. Terrified by these ominous sounds, the king consults his Brahmin ministers. And the ministers, not knowing the sound's significance, but being always greedy for gain, tell the king that these sounds are a sign of great danger for the kingdom, which can only be averted if they perform a huge sacrifice involving hundreds of living animals. As preparations for the massive animal sacrifice get underway, one young Brahmin becomes doubtful about this course of conduct and sets out to find a truly pious ascetic who might be able to interpret the ominous sounds differently and thus avert the impending slaughter of animals. Sure enough, he finds a saintly ascetic who understands the sounds of all animals and can thereby correctly interpret the sounds, all of which are messages of animal suffering at the hands of human beings. For example, the first sound was made by a female crane who was trying to convey that she is starving to death because the king's servants no longer stock her pond with fresh fish. The second sound was made by a female crow who was crying out of grief for her children because one of the king's men cruelly smashes her nest every time he walks by, thereby killing all of her hatchlings. And the same goes for the other animal sounds as well. In some of these cases, moreover, the ascetic directly translates the animal sound into specific human words, with the words themselves becoming a canonical verse. For example, the plaintive call made by a cuckoo that is kept in a cage in the palace is translated by the ascetic into the following words: "Oh, when will I leave from here, released from the king's palace? When will I enjoy myself living in the branch of a tree?" Likewise, the mournful cry of a deer kept captive on the palace grounds is translated by the ascetic as follows: "Oh, when will I leave from here, released from the king's palace? When will I drink the most excellent water, leading around my herd?" So in truth, the king has nothing at all to fear from these sounds. They do not portend any danger to him or to his kingdom. Instead, they are expressions of animal suffering, which the king himself has the power to ameliorate. In response to the ascetic's explanation, the king calls off the animal sacrifice, takes the necessary action to eliminate each animal's suffering, and grants security to all animals within the kingdom. Unlike the majority of the animal Jatakas, which do feature animals who speak, in this case, each animal has uttered an ordinary animal sound, and it's the ascetic who must translate each sound into human language that the king can understand. Only when he is provided with the correct translation is the king able to respond with generosity and compassion toward the animals in his care. In this way, the Uttasata Jataka effectively suggests that when animals cry out in their ordinary animal sounds, these sounds are self-servingly misinterpreted by greedy human beings like the ministers, who respond to them with wholesale acts of abuse and exploitation, like the animal sacrifice they're about to carry out. If we only had the wisdom to translate such sounds correctly, however, they would tell us a very different tale, a tale of widespread human cruelty toward animals and a longing on the part of animals to simply be left alone. The animal Jatakas are unique among Buddhist literature in their ability to grant us such a translation. Moreover, the fact that the ascetic who does the translating in this story is a previous birth of the Buddha himself, and the translations he provides are given canonical status, suggests that there is a Buddhist voice here speaking up in defense of animals and standing in marked contrast to the lowly depiction of animals we see in Buddhist doctrine. This is why, in my view, the animality of these animals is not secondary, but absolutely crucial. So sometimes it is language that brings human beings and animals together, sometimes it is non-linguistic animal cries, and sometimes we need a translator to move from one to the other. But in those stories in which animals do communicate through speaking, it seems to me that language often plays an ambiguous role. For on the one hand, it is their ability to speak that turns these animals into quasi-human beings with whom we can communicate, but on the other hand, what they choose to speak about is rooted in their experience as animals. In other words, they might resort to human language in order to communicate, but they sometimes feel ambivalent about doing so. In several of the Jatakas, for example, we find the theme of animals using the power of speech to tell us that human language itself is deceptive, slippery, and never to be trusted. In the Javanahamsa Jataka, a wise and virtuous goose befriends the king of Benares. After repeatedly visiting the king and even preaching to him on the theme of impermanence, the goose is invited to stay in the palace permanently so that the king can continue to benefit from his wisdom. "I would stay in your home," the goose replies, "but one day you might get drunk and demand that I be cooked." The king insists that this will never occur, and he even makes a formal promise to abstain from alcohol forevermore. But the goose understands all too well that human words cannot be trusted. The cries of jackals and birds, he says, are easy to interpret. Far harder, O king, are the words of human beings. A human may think of someone as a relative, companion, or friend, yet he who was formerly regarded with delight later turns into an enemy. We find a similar distrust of human words and labels in the Salaka Jataka and the Ahigundika Jataka, two parallel stories that both involve a monkey who somehow manages to escape from the abusive snake charmer who enslaves him. The snake charmer then attempts to lure the monkey back into captivity through false words of flattery. In the Salaka Jataka, he calls the monkey his friend, but the monkey only replies sarcastically, "You think of me as a friend, and yet you beat me with a bamboo staff?" Likewise, in the Ahigundika Jataka, he calls the monkey good-looking, whereupon the monkey replies, "What lying words! My friend, you flatter me untruthfully. Where have you ever heard or seen that a monkey is good-looking?" So here we are given a very different perspective on the human use of language. Whereas Buddhist doctrine tells us that language allows human beings to recognize social categories such as mother or sister and thereby avoid the promiscuity and incest that afflict the animal realm, here we hear a very different story from the animals themselves. Human language is suspicious and slippery, and labels such as relative or friend are never to be trusted. As the goose puts it in the Javanahamsa Jataka, the hearts of animals are straightforward, as reflected in their animal cries, while the hearts of human beings are difficult to understand. The animals of the Jatakas may be able to speak, but only so that they can tell us that human words are empty. As a deer in the Ruru Jataka puts it, human beings say one thing with their mouths and do another thing with their bodies. So this is one idea that kind of interests me, the idea that human language is prolific and creative and capable of creating entire worlds, but precisely for that reason, it can also be deceptive and false and untrustworthy. And in contrast to that, the cries of animals might be simple, but they're also completely straightforward. Animals speak their own nature, and they are incapable of lying. Now, this idea that the sounds of animals always tell the truth is also reflected in another motif that I mention in the book, but in a completely different context, and now I'm pulling it into here, and that is the pairing of the lion and the jackal. And the idea here, which is found in many places throughout the Pāli Canon, is that the jackal follows the lion around and tries to act like a lion and gets fat on the lion's leftovers and eventually comes to think that he is just as good as a lion. But as soon as he tries to roar like a lion, everybody knows he's just a jackal, because the sound that an animal makes always reveals its true nature. This is how the Patika Sutta describes it. Considering himself to be a lion, the jackal thinks, "I'm king of the beasts." Even so, he howls like a jackal. And how can the wretched howl of the jackal compare to a lion's roar? In a passage from the Anguttara Nikaya commentary, we're actually given the jackal's reasoning. The jackal looks at the lion and thinks to himself, "He's an animal and so am I. He has 4 limbs and so do I. So I too will roar a lion's roar." But of course, his voice immediately betrays him. He can only produce the howl of a jackal, which is here described as a broken voice that makes an unpleasant sound. In the Siha Kotuka Jataka, a male lion and a female jackal actually mate with each other to produce a half-lion, half-jackal cub. And this is how the cub is described. His paws, his claws, his mane, and his body, in all these attributes he was like his father, but in voice he was like his mother. He had the paws of a lion and the claws of a lion, and he stood upon a lion's feet. He was a lion living in a pride of lions, but his howl alone revealed otherwise. So not only does the cry of an animal always reveal the animal's true nature, it also seems to dominate over other factors like an animal's appearance or behavior. So the sound of an animal is always true. Now here, of course, because the jackal is a low and inferior animal and is almost always depicted negatively in Buddhist literature, this idea is being used to criticize the jackal for trying to pass himself off as a lion. But in the other Jatakas I've been talking about, it is precisely the truthfulness and sincerity of animal sounds that is valued and that is positively contrasted with the duplicity and deceitfulness of human language. So again, on the one hand, the animals of the Pāli Jatakas may use language in order to communicate. On the other hand, they are often ambivalent about doing so. Let me turn now to another story that again points to the ambiguity surrounding animals who speak and their ambivalence toward using human language. In the Garahita Jataka, a monkey is captured in the forest, brought to the king, and turned into a palace pet. He lives in the palace for many years until finally the king, being pleased by the monkey's faithful service, releases him back into the forest. The other monkeys in the forest quickly gather around him, eager to hear about his life among the human beings. "You must know about the ways of the human world," they say. "Tell us about them. We want to hear." "Don't ask me about the ways of human beings," he replies. "No, please tell us. We want to hear." Finally, the monkey relents. "Human beings," he says, "even Brahmins and Kshatriyas, constantly cry out, 'Mine, mine.' They do not realize that because of impermanence, everything that exists will disappear. Listen now to the ways of those blind fools. 'The gold is mine, the gold is mine.' That's all they talk about day and night. Human beings are stupid and do not see the noble Dharma." So here, in an exact reversal of the Buddhist doctrinal view, it is human beings rather than animals who lack the higher mental faculties and are thus incapable of realizing the truth of impermanence or other Buddhist teachings. It is human beings who fail to see the Dharma. Instead, they spend their entire lives turning everything around them into mine, mine. Not only material things, as the commentary clarifies, but also both two-footed and four-footed creatures. Human dominance over both other human beings and non-human animals is thus revealed to be just one symptom of a pervasive human self-centeredness. From the animal's point of view, human social institutions such as marriage also take on a bizarre and frightening cast. For the monkey then goes on to explain that each human household consists of a man and a woman. The woman, he says, is bought from her mother and father with a lot of money, then she's dressed up and adorned, placed into a vehicle, and brought to the house with a great retinue. And the man, he says, constantly strikes the slaves and servants of the household with the verbal daggers of human language. "Hey, you wicked slave, don't do that." Acting as if he owns them, he orders many people around. Indeed, the monkey concludes, there is much in the human world that is not right. By making its readers privy to a private conversation among the monkeys, the Garahita Jataka succeeds in opening our eyes to the strange and frightening nature of human social institutions that lead inevitably to the power structures of gender, class, and caste, which are perceived with far more terror than the natural laws of predator and prey. The other monkeys, in fact, react with horror. "Stop talking, they say. "We have heard things that are not fitting to hear." And they covered their ears tightly with both hands. And because they had heard something terrible in that place, they came to despise that place and went elsewhere. End quote. Faced with the horrors of human domination over both animals and other human beings, the monkeys have heard enough. They clasp their hands over their ears and demand that language cease. The animals of the Pāli Jātakas thus use the power of human speech to condemn the human world and its treatment of non-human animals. But ultimately, the horrific nature of what they speak about makes their speech lapse back into silence. Okay, so this is the basic theme I'm kind of interested in exploring further. That is to say, the anomalous nature of animals who speak. Because on the one hand, speech is often posited as that which distinguishes human beings from animals and elevates human beings above animals. But on the other hand, the animals of the Jatakas often use speech to bring human beings and animals closer together. And yet, they also display ambivalence about doing so, as if they did not wish to be tainted by the faults that so often accompany human language. I'm also interested in exploring further another motif that might be seen as the flip side of this. I'm not sure about this. I'm just floating this idea out here. That is to say, on the one hand, the animals of the Pāli Jātakas are suspicious of human language as being dangerous and untrustworthy. On the other hand, the human beings who speak to us in the rest of the Pāli canon often associate low and crass uses of language with animals. And here I'm referring to the interesting category of Tiracana Kata, or animal talk. This is a type of speech that is condemned by the Buddha. It's depicted as being unseemly for monks to engage in, and as something that violates right speech as an element of the Eightfold Path. In a passage from the Anguttara Nikaya, Tiracana Kata is defined as follows. Talk about kings, thieves, and ministers of state. Talk about armies, perils, and wars. Talk about food, drink, garments, and beds. Talk about garlands and scents. Talk about relatives, vehicles, Villages, towns, cities, and countries. Talk about women and talk about heroes. Street talk and talk by the well. Talk about the departed. Miscellaneous talk. Speculation about the world and the sea. Talk about becoming this or that. So in other words, it is talk that is frivolous and childish, unedifying, and not concerned with anything important. And how is the low status of such talk indicated? It's indicated through association with animals and referred to as animal talk. So again, there's kind of an interesting contrast here, though I'm not quite sure what to do with it. While animals are distrustful of human language, human beings criticize certain forms of language by associating them with animals. In one case, animals look suspiciously at humans. In the other case, humans look suspiciously at animals. Closely related to Tiracana Kata is another category also referring to animals, Tiracana Vidya, which refers to various base arts and sciences that are again condemned by the Buddha as being unseemly for monks to engage in and a violation of right livelihood as an element of the Eightfold Path. In other words, you should not make your living through the practice of these arts and sciences. This category includes such things as reading palms, interpreting dreams, using spells and charms, and divining the future through different signs and portents. These are not activities that are suitable for monks, and once again, the low and base status of all such activities is indicated by calling them the animal arts, Tiracana Vidya. And, interestingly enough, not only is the entire category associated with animals, but several members of the category pertain directly to animals. For example, the knowledge of snake lore, the knowledge of rat lore, of bird lore, and of crow lore. Especially interesting is the inclusion on this list of the knowledge of animal cries. In other words, the base art by means of which a human being is able to understand the cries of various animals. Depicting this type of knowledge as a low and unseemly craft stands in stark contrast, of course, to what we just saw earlier in the Uttasada Jataka, where the Bodhisattva himself appeared as a wise ascetic who understood the sounds of animals and could translate them correctly for the king, thereby ending the immoral practice of animal sacrifice and winning the security of all animals within the kingdom. Nor is that the only Jataka to depict such knowledge in a positive way. In the Macha Jataka, the Bodhisattva is a Brahmin priest who again understands the sounds of all animals, and he uses this ability to compassionately rescue a fish who has been caught in a fisherman's net. Likewise, in the Karaputta Jataka, a king compassionately saves the life of a Naga, and out of gratitude, the Naga gives the king a spell for understanding the sounds of all animals. Throughout the story, this ability is depicted as being, first of all, highly entertaining, because apparently it's fun to know what animals are saying, but also as something special, valuable, and not to be shared with others. In fact, the Bodhisattva in this story is another character who helps the king hang on to the spell for himself and avoid having to share it with his wife. He actually advises the king to beat his wife rather than sharing the spell with her. So in all of these Jatakas, the ability to understand the cries of animals is always depicted positively and is always connected in some way with saving an animal's life from the harm inflicted by human beings. And this stands in rather stark contrast, of course, to the discourse surrounding Tiracana Vidya, where the very same ability is depicted as a low, base, and inferior art. Let me begin to move toward a conclusion now by leaving behind my specific focus on the issues of human language and animal cries, and instead returning to the larger contrast I've been trying to draw between Buddhist doctrine on the one hand and the world of the Pāli Jātakas on the other hand. In Buddhist doctrine, there is a gulf between human beings and animals. Animals are denigrated as being a low and inferior form of rebirth, and their lack of spiritual potential is emphasized in order to safeguard the prerogatives of being a human being. In the Pāli Jātakas, on the other hand, the distinction between human beings and animals is frequently blurred. There is an emphasis instead on their shared status as sentient beings who suffer. And in some cases, it is in fact human beings rather than animals who are spiritually impotent and morally repugnant. So how can we make sense of the contradiction between these two views? Well, on the most general level, I think we could see this as just one particular manifestation of something that seems to be universal, and that is humanity's contradictory relationship to the animal. On the one hand, we ourselves are animals. On the other hand, we define ourselves in opposition to all non-human animals. So in humanity's relationship to the animal, it seems that there is always a simultaneous kinship and otherness, identity and difference, attraction and repulsion. Thus, in Buddhist doctrine, there is an emphasis on otherness, where the animal is seen as other to the human subject and defined in stark opposition to whatever characterizes the human. In the Pāli Jatakas, on the other hand, there's an emphasis on kinship, where we recognize our shared creaturehood with animals and allow animals to become subjects in their own right, rather than objects available for human use and consumption. The contradictory views of animals found in Buddhist literature, then, perhaps come from the very same human impulse that causes many of us to love some animals and dine on others. The animal studies scholar Erica Fudge has described this dynamic by observing that anthropocentrism creates anthropomorphism. In other words, the desire to see human beings as superior leads inevitably to contrasting human beings with animals. And yet, this contrast is only made possible by admitting a certain likeness between them. Paradoxically, Fudge states, humans need animals in order to be human. So there is, I think, a kind of general human explanation for the contradictory views of animals we find in different genres of Buddhist literature. If we want to explain these different views in a specifically Buddhist manner, on the other hand, then I tend to think of them not so much in terms of outright conflict or contradiction, but rather in terms of the different interests of soteriology on the one hand and ethics on the other. In other words, when the human subject is thinking soteriologically, when she ponders her own attempt to eradicate suffering and reach an ultimate goal, there is a need to distinguish herself from the beastly realm and invest herself in those capacities she possesses that are believed to be uniquely human. When, on the other hand, she's thinking ethically, when she ponders her ethical relationships with other sentient creatures in the universe, there is a need to see the world from another being's perspective, be alive to the reality of their suffering, and shine the harsh light of truth upon her own moral shortcomings. Thus do we find the otherness of animals emphasized in the realm of Buddhist doctrine and the kinship with animals emphasized in the Pāli Jatakas, a genre of literature that is arguably much closer to the everyday ethical concerns of ordinary people. So maybe these contradictions derive from the different concerns of soteriology and ethics. Moreover, if we think about the relationship between soteriology and ethics as Buddhism understands it, we should remember that ethics are always presented as the necessary foundation for soteriology. It is perhaps for this reason that the animals of the Pāli Jatakas seem to speak with a special authority, pulling the human being back from her human-centered ambitions just enough to understand that those ambitions must ultimately be rooted in an ethical relationship with the more than human world. So this is why I would argue that the Pāli Jatakas are not just pre-Buddhist Indian folklore, nor are their animal characters just allegorical stand-ins for human beings. Instead, they do have something to say as animals, and they should be taken seriously. When these animals speak, in other words, we should have the courtesy to listen. Thank you.